Go back to your scrapyard. The words echoed through the glass-walled conference hall, followed by a wave of laughter that rolled across the room like a sudden storm. No one questioned the insult. No one defended the man standing near the back. And certainly no one imagined that less than half an hour later, a four-star general would walk through those same doors, stop in his tracks, and call that man by name. The headquarters of Hayes Defense Systems stood just outside Colorado Springs, a sprawling campus of steel, glass, and American ambition. On that bright October morning, executives, engineers, government officials, and military representatives filled the main presentation center. The company was preparing to unveil a multi-million-dollar defense modernization project, one expected to attract national attention. Every detail had been polished, every guest carefully selected, every chair filled. Well, almost every guest. Ethan Walker never looked like he belonged in places like this. At 42, the single father spent most of his days running a modest scrapyard on the outskirts of town. His denim work shirt carried faint stains from years of honest labor. His boots showed the wear of long days spent salvaging parts, repairing equipment, and keeping a small business alive. He wasn't there because he was important. He was there because his company had delivered recycled specialty metals used in a prototype component for the project. To Ethan, it was just another job. One more invoice. One more week closer to paying for his daughter Lily's future. He stood quietly near the rear wall, hands folded, listening as executives discussed innovation, leadership, and vision. The room buzzed with confidence. Screens glowed. Cameras waited. Then Charlotte Hayes stepped onto the stage. At 38, the CEO carried herself with the kind of authority that made people straighten in their seats. Her tailored navy suit looked flawless beneath the lights. Her voice was sharp, controlled, and accustomed to being obeyed. The room fell silent as she began speaking about the company's achievements. Then her eyes drifted toward the back, toward Ethan. A slight crease formed between her brows. She paused. "Excuse me," she said, interrupting herself. Heads turned. How exactly did he get in here? Several people followed her gaze. Ethan glanced up, surprised. A few attendees immediately noticed his work clothes and exchanged amused looks. Charlotte tilted her head. "This event is restricted to industry professionals." A ripple of chuckles spread through the audience. Ethan remained calm. "I'm here as a supplier," he said quietly, "for the recycled alloys." Charlotte gave a polite smile that never reached her eyes. "Well, thank you for your contribution." More laughter followed. Then came the sentence that would change everything. "But perhaps it's time to go back to your scrapyard." The room erupted. Some laughed openly. Others looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to speak. Ethan simply nodded once. No anger. No argument. No attempt to defend himself. He lowered his eyes briefly, then turned toward the exit. Outside the massive windows, autumn sunlight stretched across the front range. Inside, the laughter slowly faded. Yet something about the man's silence lingered in the air. It was the kind of silence that comes from carrying burdens no one else can see. The kind that doesn't need applause. The kind that doesn't need permission. And as Ethan reached the hallway beyond the conference room, unaware eyes followed him. Because hidden beneath years of sacrifice, beneath the scrapyard, beneath the oil stains and quiet routine of a devoted father, was a story no one in that building knew. A story that was only minutes away from being revealed. The cool mountain air greeted Ethan as he stepped outside the headquarters building and into the parking lot. Behind him, conversations resumed, presentations continued, and executives returned to discussing numbers that seemed larger than most people could imagine. Yet none of that followed him. He had spent enough years learning that pride was a heavy thing to carry. His old pickup truck sat near the edge of the lot, its faded paint reflecting the bright Colorado sun. Ethan opened the driver's door and climbed inside. For a moment, he simply rested his hands on the steering wheel. Not angry, not embarrassed, just tired. The dashboard clock read 10:14 a.m. In less than an hour, he needed to be across town. Lily would be getting out of school early for a parent volunteer event, and he had promised he would be there. That promise mattered more than any room full of executives ever could. The engine rumbled to life. As he pulled onto the road, the city slowly gave way to open stretches of land dotted with warehouses, machine shops, and small family-owned businesses. 20 minutes later, he turned through the familiar gates of Walker Salvage and Recycling. The scrapyard spread across nearly 5 acres. Stacks of reclaimed metal stood neatly organized. Old equipment waited for second chances. Nothing about the place was glamorous, but everything about it was honest. A young employee waved as Ethan parked. "How did the big meeting go?" he asked. Ethan grabbed his work gloves from the seat. "They had coffee," he said with a faint smile. The employee laughed. "That bad?" Ethan shrugged. Work is work. He never spoke much about himself. The people who worked for him respected that. Inside the small office near the front gate, sunlight streamed through dusty blinds. Family photographs lined one wall. Most showed Lily, at 6 years old, holding a fishing rod almost taller than she was. At 8, standing beside a science fair project. At 10, wearing a soccer uniform 3 sizes too large because she insisted she would grow into it. Ethan paused at the newest photo sitting on his desk. Lily stood smiling beside her middle school honor roll certificate. Her blonde hair was tied back in a ponytail. Her eyes looked remarkably like her mother's. Next to the frame sat an old wooden box. The edges were worn smooth with age. Most visitors never noticed it. Ethan preferred it that way. A ringing phone interrupted the silence. He answered. "Walker Salvage." "Dad." Lily's cheerful voice instantly softened his expression. "Did you remember?" "Remember what?" Ethan asked. "Nice try." She laughed. "The volunteer event starts at noon." "I know. You promise you are coming?" Ethan looked toward the wooden box for a brief second before turning away. "I promised, kiddo." "Good. Because everyone else's parents wear fancy clothes." Ethan smiled. "That sounds dangerous. You are wearing your work shirt again, are you not?" "Probably." Lily groaned dramatically. "Dad, I will be there." A pause followed. Then her voice softened. "That is all I wanted to know." After the call ended, the office fell quiet once more. Outside, machinery hummed. Wind rustled through the chain-link fences. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley. Ethan reached for the wooden box. His fingers rested lightly on the lid. For a moment, he considered opening it. Instead, he slid it back into the desk drawer and closed it. Some chapters of life were easier left unread. What he did not know was that events were already moving beyond his control. Back at Hayes Defense Systems, a problem had just surfaced. A serious one. And before the day was over, people who had laughed at him would find themselves searching for the very man they had dismissed. Back at Hayes Defense Systems, confidence had begun to crack. What started as a routine system verification had quietly turned into something far more serious. Engineers gathered around glowing monitors. Project managers moved quickly between workstations. Conversations that had sounded polished and rehearsed earlier in the morning now carried an edge of concern. Charlotte Hayes stood at the center of it all, her attention fixed on a series of diagnostic reports displayed across a massive screen. "Run it again," she said. "We already did," one engineer replied. "Then run it again." Fingers moved across keyboards. Data scrolled. Charts refreshed. The result remained exactly the same. A critical guidance support module was producing inconsistent readings. Not catastrophic, not dangerous, but enough to stop the demonstration scheduled for that afternoon. Enough to place months of preparation at risk. Charlotte folded her arms. "Tell me someone has an explanation." Silence answered first. Then another engineer cleared his throat. "We believe it may be a materials integration issue." "Believe?" Charlotte asked. "Or no?" The engineer looked down. "We do not know yet." The room grew still. Beyond the glass walls, invited guests continued touring the facility, unaware that the company's most important presentation of the year was beginning to unravel behind the scenes. A senior project director stepped forward. "If this is not resolved before General Richard Kane arrives, we could face delays." Charlotte already knew that. The general was not simply attending. He represented one of the largest potential military contracts in company history. Delays meant questions. Questions meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant risk. She turned toward the screen again. "Start from the beginning. Every supplier, every component, every material source." A list appeared. Hundreds of entries filled the display. Metals, electronics, fabrication partners, specialized contractors. Charlotte scanned the information quickly. Then one line caught her attention. Walker Salvage and Recycling. She barely remembered the name. Just a small supplier. Just a scrapyard. Her gaze moved past it without another thought. Across town, Ethan was loading reclaimed steel onto a transport trailer. The afternoon sun reflected off rows of organized metal. A forklift hummed nearby. Business continued as usual. Yet something unusual caught his eye. One of the delivery manifests from the defense project sat folded on a workbench. He picked it up while waiting for a shipment to be secured. Years of experience made certain details impossible to ignore. His eyes moved across specifications, alloy percentages, and processing notes. Then he frowned slightly. "That is odd," he murmured. He read the document again. A second time. Then a third. The numbers themselves were not wrong. The problem was the sequence. A subtle inconsistency. Easy to miss. The kind of detail most people would overlook because it appeared perfectly reasonable on paper. Ethan set the document down. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe someone had already noticed. He had no reason to involve himself. After all, nobody at Hayes Defense Systems seemed interested in hearing his opinion. Still, something about the figures lingered in his mind. The same way an unfinished puzzle lingers. The same way an unanswered question refuses to disappear. Hundreds of people were searching for a solution at that very moment. And sitting quietly inside a scrapyard office, a single father had just taken the first step towards seeing what they could not. Ethan tried to put the thought aside. He had deliveries to finish, invoices to review, and a promise to keep. By 11:45, he was locking the office and heading toward Lily's school. The folded materials report still sat on the passenger seat beside him. Every time he glanced at it, the same detail bothered him. Not the alloy composition, not the fabrication process, the sequencing. Someone had approved two separate calibration standards that should never have been used together. Either the documentation was wrong, or the system was reading from conflicting assumptions. The farther he drove, the more convinced he became. At the school gymnasium, folding tables filled the floor. Parents carried trays of cookies. Teachers organized displays. Children moved from booth to booth with the endless energy only middle school students seemed capable of possessing. Ethan spotted Lily immediately. She waved both arms above her head. "Dad," he smiled. "You look busy. You are late by 3 minutes. Good thing I drove fast enough to make up 2 of them." She laughed and wrapped her arms around him. For the next hour, the defense project disappeared from his mind. They helped set up chairs. They listened to a student orchestra perform. They sampled brownies from a fundraising table. The ordinary moments felt far more valuable than anything happening inside a corporate boardroom. Then Ethan's phone vibrated. He ignored it. A minute later it rang again. Unknown number. He silenced it. A third call followed almost immediately. Lily noticed. Important. Ethan checked the screen. Another unfamiliar number. Probably not. But something told him otherwise. He stepped into the hallway and answered. "Ethan Walker." A nervous voice responded. "Mr. Walker, this is David Mercer from Hayes Defense Systems." Ethan leaned against the wall. "What can I do for you?" "We have a technical issue involving the recycled alloy shipment documentation." Ethan waited. "And one of our engineers noticed you submitted a processing note with your last delivery." Ethan remembered the note. A simple recommendation attached almost as an afterthought. Did anyone read it? Silence followed. Apparently not. Ethan almost smiled. "What seems to be the problem?" The engineer quickly explained the inconsistencies plaguing the system. As he spoke, Ethan's expression remained calm. The explanation confirmed exactly what he had suspected. "You are referencing 2 calibration paths at the same time," Ethan said. "That would create conflicting guidance outputs." Silence. Then the engineer spoke again. "How did you know that?" Ethan glanced through the hallway window at Lily laughing with her friends. "Because the report practically announces it." Another pause. "Would you be willing to come back and take a look?" Ethan hesitated. The memory of the morning was still fresh. The laughter, the dismissive smiles, the feeling of being seen as less than everyone else in the room. "You have plenty of experts there already," he replied. "Mr. Walker, please." The engineer sounded exhausted now. "General Kane arrives in less than 2 hours. Nobody can solve this." Ethan looked down at the folded report still tucked beneath his arm. Then he closed his eyes briefly. Some people help because they are respected. Others help because it is the right thing to do. And Ethan Walker had spent most of his life choosing the second path. 25 minutes later, Ethan parked outside Hayes Defense Systems for the second time that day. The sun hung lower now, casting long golden reflections across the glass exterior of the building. Employees moved quickly through the entrance carrying tablets, folders, and half-finished cups of coffee. The atmosphere had changed completely. Confidence had been replaced by urgency. The moment Ethan stepped inside, he could feel it. A young engineer hurried toward him. "Mr. Walker?" Ethan nodded. "This way." They moved through a maze of hallways and security checkpoints. Every screen seemed filled with diagnostic reports. Every conversation sounded strained. Nobody was laughing now. Inside the main operations center, nearly 20 engineers stood gathered around a large display. Wall. Charlotte Hayes stood near the front. Her expression was composed, but only barely. The moment she saw Ethan enter, surprise flashed across her face. "You came back?" she asked. Ethan looked at the screens. Someone asked for help. One engineer immediately stepped forward. "We isolated the inconsistency, but we cannot determine why the guidance outputs keep shifting." Another pointed at a cluster of charts. "Everything appears correct until final integration." Ethan studied the display silently. Numbers flowed across the screens. Material tolerances, calibration references, performance simulations. He said nothing for nearly a minute. The room waited. Finally, he walked closer to the largest monitor. "Scroll back 3 pages. The engineer obeyed. "There." Ethan pointed. "Now compare that sequence with the secondary calibration standard." Several engineers exchanged confused looks. One typed rapidly. A moment later, both datasets appeared side by side. Ethan folded his arms. "You are asking the system to interpret the same component using 2 different baseline assumptions." "That should not matter," one engineer replied. "It does if the material source was processed under the first standard and tested under the second." Silence. The engineer frowned. "Wait." Another engineer leaned forward. "He is right." Fingers flew across keyboards. More calculations appeared. Then another voice spoke. "That would explain the drift." A third engineer looked up from his station. "And the inconsistent outputs." The room suddenly filled with movement. People began rerunning simulations. New data populated the screens. For the first time all afternoon, the error indicators started disappearing. Charlotte watched everything unfold without speaking. Less than 10 minutes earlier, nobody had known where to look. Now the problem was unraveling piece by piece. One of the senior project directors turned toward Ethan. "How did you spot that?" Ethan shrugged. "The paperwork told the story." The director blinked. "You saw that from a supplier report?" It was not hidden. Several engineers exchanged looks that suggested otherwise. Before anyone could ask another question, the doors at the far end of the operations center opened. Conversation stopped. Footsteps echoed across the polished floor. Security personnel entered first. Then several military officers followed. And finally, General Richard Kane stepped into the room. The 4-star general carried himself with quiet authority earned over decades of service. Every executive immediately straightened. Every engineer stepped aside. Charlotte moved forward to greet him. But before she could speak, the general's eyes drifted across the room. They passed over the executives, past the project directors, past the engineers. Then they stopped. His expression changed instantly. He stared toward the back of the room where Ethan Walker stood beside the display screens. For a brief moment, the entire operations center seemed to hold its breath. The room went completely quiet. General Richard Kane had entered dozens of facilities, attended countless briefings, and met some of the most influential people in the country. Yet at that moment, his attention remained fixed on one man standing beside a display screen. Charlotte noticed it immediately. So did everyone else. The general took a step forward. Then another. The conversations died. The movement stopped. Even the constant tapping of keyboards seemed to disappear. Ethan stood calmly where he was. His expression never changed. General Kane stopped several feet away and stared at him for a long moment. There was disbelief in his eyes, recognition, and something else. Respect. Finally, he spoke. "Sergeant Ethan Walker?" The words landed like a thunderclap. Several engineers exchanged confused looks. Charlotte blinked. The project directors glanced toward Ethan and then back toward the general. Ethan gave a small nod. "It has been a while, sir." A smile slowly appeared on the general's face. 15 years. Nobody spoke. Nobody seemed willing to interrupt whatever was happening. General Kane extended his hand. Ethan shook it. The general held it firmly. "I thought you disappeared." Ethan gave a faint smile. "Life had other plans." The general laughed softly. "That sounds like you." Charlotte stepped forward cautiously. "General Kane, you know Mr. Walker." The general looked at her, then back at Ethan. "Know him?" He almost seemed surprised by the question. There was a time when half the people in my command knew his name. The room grew even quieter. Charlotte felt something uncomfortable settle in her chest. Earlier that day, she had seen a scrapyard owner. Nothing more. Now she was watching one of the most respected military leaders in the country speak to him like an old colleague. One engineer finally found his voice. "Sergeant." The general nodded. "That is right." His gaze returned to Ethan. "You still hate attention?" Ethan sighed. "More than ever." A few people laughed nervously. The tension eased slightly, but curiosity only grew stronger. The general folded his arms. "You solved the integration problem?" Several engineers answered before Ethan could. "In less than 10 minutes. He found what all of us missed. We spent hours chasing the wrong issue." General Kane nodded as though none of that surprised him. "That sounds familiar." Charlotte studied Ethan carefully. Every assumption she had made that morning now felt increasingly fragile. The work shirt, the dusty boots, the quiet manner. None of it seemed to fit the reaction she was witnessing. The general turned toward the project team. "Ladies and gentlemen, if Ethan Walker says there is a problem, you should probably listen." One engineer smiled awkwardly. "We understand that now." The general's eyes softened. "Trust me, I learned that lesson years ago." Ethan looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Outside the operations center windows, the late afternoon sun painted the mountains gold. Inside, a different kind of shift was taking place. The room had stopped seeing a scrapyard owner. The room had started seeing a mystery. And for the first time all day, Charlotte Hayes realized she knew almost nothing about the man she had dismissed only hours earlier. No one returned to work. No one looked at the screens. The technical problem that had dominated the afternoon suddenly seemed less important than the question hanging over the room. Who exactly was Ethan Walker? General Kane seemed to understand what everyone was thinking. He glanced around the operations center and shook his head with a faint smile. "You are all looking at him like he is some kind of mystery." Ethan sighed. "Richard, do not start," the general replied. A few people laughed quietly. "You always hated this part." Charlotte stepped closer. "What part?" The general looked at her. "Talking about himself." Ethan folded his arms. "There is nothing to talk about. That is where you are wrong." The general's voice remained calm, but there was conviction behind every word. "There are people standing in this room who think you are just a supplier." Nobody corrected him. 15 years ago, the general continued, Sergeant Ethan Walker was one of the most respected technical specialists I ever worked with. Several engineers exchanged surprised glances. The general walked slowly through the room as he spoke. "Most people think military service is only about rank or authority. Sometimes it is. But sometimes it is about solving problems nobody else can solve." He pointed toward the screens. "What happened here today reminds me of exactly who he was." Ethan looked toward the floor. The attention clearly made him uncomfortable. "There were projects that stalled for months," the general continued. Then Ethan would walk into the room, study the data, ask 3 questions, and find the answer everyone else missed. One engineer blinked. "Seriously?" "More times than I can count." The room grew quiet again. Outside the windows, clouds drifted slowly above the mountains. Inside, every person seemed focused on the same man. Charlotte noticed something she had missed earlier. Ethan never appeared proud. He never seemed eager to impress anyone. If anything, he looked like he wished the conversation would end. "Then why leave?" one project manager finally asked. If he was that good, the question settled heavily over the room. For the first time, the general's expression softened. He looked toward Ethan before answering. "Because life happens." Nobody spoke. About 13 years ago, Ethan lost his wife. The room became completely silent. Charlotte felt her chest tighten. She remembered the photographs she had briefly seen when reviewing supplier records. A young girl. Family pictures. Nothing more. The general continued. He had a little daughter to raise. She was all that mattered. Ethan remained still. Promotions came. Opportunities came. Leadership positions came. The general smiled sadly. He turned them all down. One engineer frowned. "Why?" The general looked directly at him. "Because every one of those opportunities would have taken him away from his child." Silence followed. Not awkward silence. Respectful silence. The kind that arrives when people suddenly understand the weight of another person's choices. Charlotte slowly looked toward Ethan. Earlier that day, she had measured him by his clothes, his job, and his appearance. Now she was beginning to understand something much deeper. This was not a man who had failed to become important. This was a man who had willingly walked away from recognition because someone else needed him more. And somehow, that realization carried more weight than any title she had heard all afternoon. The atmosphere inside the operations center had changed completely. Earlier that day, people had measured Ethan Walker by oil stains and work boots. Now they listened whenever he spoke. Yet the man at the center of everyone's attention seemed interested in only one thing: solving the problem. General Kane noticed it first. While executives whispered and engineers exchanged amazed looks, Ethan had already turned back toward the display screens. "Show me the updated simulation," he said. One engineer immediately complied. New data filled the monitors. Chart stabilized. Error indicators dropped. But Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. There is still something wrong. The room froze. "What?" another engineer asked. Ethan stepped closer to the screen. "You fixed the calibration conflict." He pointed toward a sequence of numbers. But that only removed the symptom. Several engineers leaned forward. "There is another issue further upstream." Charlotte stared at the display. "How can you tell?" Ethan studied the data for several seconds. "Because the system is still compensating for a variable that should not exist." Silence followed. Then fingers began flying across keyboards once again. Teams reviewed datasets. Reports reopened. Additional diagnostics launched. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Finally, one of the senior engineers looked up suddenly. "Found it." The room turned toward him. A manufacturing parameter was copied from an early prototype and never removed. Another engineer verified it. "He is right." A third checked the impact assessment. "That explains everything." The operations center erupted into focused activity. Updated calculations flowed across the screens. Simulations restarted. One by one, every warning disappeared. Green indicators replaced yellow alerts. Performance metrics stabilized. For the first time all day, the system operated exactly as intended. A long breath escaped from somewhere in the room. Then another. The tension that had gripped the building for hours finally began to release. Charlotte watched the screens carefully. Run the full validation sequence. Already running. 30 seconds later, the final report appeared. Complete success. The room burst into applause. Engineers smiled. Project managers shook hands. Several people looked directly toward Ethan. He seemed almost embarrassed by the reaction. "It was not that complicated," he said. One engineer laughed. "For you, maybe." General Kane folded his arms with obvious satisfaction. "That sounds familiar too." Charlotte remained silent. She remembered the conference hall. The laughter. Her own words. They seemed distant now, yet impossible to forget. Ethan had every reason to walk away when they called him back. Every reason to ignore the request. Instead, he had returned and helped without asking for recognition, payment, or credit. The realization unsettled her more than she expected. Across the room, Ethan checked the time on his phone. His expression changed immediately. "I need to go." Several people looked surprised. "Go," one project manager asked. "The crisis is over." Ethan slipped the phone back into his pocket. "My daughter has a school choir performance in 40 minutes. The room fell quiet again. Not because of mystery this time. Because everyone suddenly understood. General Kane smiled warmly. "Some priorities never change." Ethan nodded. They should not. As he turned toward the exit, nobody tried to stop him. And for the first time that day, every person in the room understood that the most remarkable thing about Ethan Walker was not what he had done. It was what he chose to value most. The school auditorium was already filling when Ethan arrived. Parents filed into rows of folding chairs. Teachers guided students toward the stage. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from a refreshment table near the entrance. It was an ordinary evening in a small Colorado community. Exactly the kind of place where nobody cared about titles, contracts, or executive offices. Ethan preferred it that way. He slipped quietly into a seat near the middle of the room just as Lily spotted him from the stage. Her face brightened instantly. She raised a small hand. Ethan waved back. That simple exchange meant more to him than any recognition he had received all day. A few minutes later, the auditorium lights dimmed. The choir director stepped forward and welcomed the audience. Then the students began to sing. Their young voices filled the room with warmth and sincerity. Ethan sat quietly, listening. Around him, parents smiled, recorded videos, and applauded after each song. For the first time that day, everything felt peaceful. Then movement near the back doors caught his attention. Several people had entered the auditorium. Ethan recognized them immediately. General Richard Kane, Charlotte Hayes, 2 project directors, and several engineers from Hayes Defense Systems. They walked quietly to avoid disturbing the performance and took seats near the rear. Ethan looked surprised. General Kane simply smiled. The music continued. Song after song echoed through the auditorium. Finally, the performance ended. Parents rose to their feet in applause. Students beamed with pride. Lily hurried off the stage and ran directly toward her father. Ethan knelt as she threw her arms around him. "You made it. I promised. Did you save the project?" Ethan laughed softly. Something like that. Before he could say anything else, Charlotte approached. She looked very different from the confident executive who had stood on stage that morning. There was no audience now. No presentation. No spotlight. Only honesty. "Mr. Walker," she said quietly. Ethan stood. "Ms. Hayes." She took a breath. "I owe you an apology." The nearby conversations seemed to fade. "This morning I judged you before I knew anything about you." Ethan remained silent. Charlotte continued. "Then when our company needed help, you came back anyway." Her voice softened. "Thank you." Ethan glanced toward Lily, then back at Charlotte. "Everyone makes mistakes." "Not like that." Charlotte shook her head. "What you did today showed more character than anything I accomplished." For a moment neither spoke. Then Ethan smiled gently. "Character is not something you accomplish. It is something you practice." Charlotte lowered her eyes. The words seemed to settle deeply. General Kane stepped forward. Without a word, he stood a few feet away and raised his hand in a formal salute. The conversation around them stopped. The engineers fell silent. The project directors stood motionless. Ethan looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Richard, let me finish." The general's voice carried quiet emotion. "I have spent my career honoring people for achievements. But today reminded me that the greatest service is not always performed in uniform." The auditorium grew still. Sometimes it is a father keeping his promises. No one spoke. No one moved. Lily looked up at her father with pride shining in her eyes. And in that moment, nobody remembered the work shirt. Nobody remembered the scrapyard. Nobody remembered the laughter from earlier that day. They remembered something far more important. They remembered a man who never demanded respect, yet earned it. A man who never announced his worth, yet revealed it through grace. And as silence settled gently across the room, Ethan Walker stood beside his daughter, exactly where he had always wanted to be.